Baldur's Gate 4 started development in Larian Studios before they chose to do something else. Get that game a vault! I have talked about my inkling on the reason why Larian didn't want to continue doing Baldur's Gate stuff before we've ever heard anything about them even potentially doing a Baldur's Gate 4. I've said from the time we found out that they had backtracked on even doing DLC for Baldur's Gate 3, because apparently initially they were like, yeah, we'll do, that's right, Waidu, you go get your peepo poo-poo on, man. We knew that they were originally going to do some DLC. This is me now, yeah. Well, after we finish the news, everybody will have their chance to go peepo poo-poo. Dumplings. Gotta go drop the kids off, you know? Drop the kids off at the pool, man. I think that when we found out that Larian was no longer interested in doing content for Baldur's Gate, I was personally under the impression that I didn't think Larian wanted to have anything to do with Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast anymore. And I talked about this whenever I brought up this this article in the first place this morning when we found it. I just, you know, you talk about Hasbro being the parent company, Wizards of the Coast being underneath them, and the things that we know about the fact that they own the licensing of Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of the things that have happened as of recent with like the open gaming license, I think is what it's called, for Dungeons and Dragons, and how they had to backtrack off of that because it was getting really gross with the kinds of things they were trying to push out on trying to revamp the open gaming license. It was going to be taking advantage of a lot of their partners on Dungeons and Dragons, and the way that people were going to be able to use Dungeons and Dragons within their world building elements of whether it be video games or tabletop or anything like that, and it was looking really gross. I think that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro has been a pretty gross look for quite some time now. And Larian, for me, is one of those companies in the industry. They're unique. I'll say that. First and foremost, I mean, you're talking about an independent developer that is large, right? You don't see that very often. A large independent studio, and they're doing things the right way. They have for a long time, right? So you're talking about Larian. They in the current state of the industry, just to give you context of why I think that it's very apparent they do things the right way. In the current state of the industry, where most companies are dwindling, most companies are struggling, to hold their head above water. Larian has come out with a lot of quotes about, if these companies were doing things the right way, they wouldn't be struggling. And I think to an extent that's true. I think most of that is aimed at the bigger companies. They're not talking about smaller indie companies and stuff that maybe just aren't getting the amount of traction that maybe they deserve on the front of some of their games, because it's hard as a smaller developer to get your game in the limelight and stuff, right? But a lot of these bigger companies definitely have not set themselves up for success on any kind of front of what's happening in the industry right now, whereas Larian is thriving. They're hiring more people. They're opening more studios, things like that. They've had a lot of quotes come out about how it's to the extent of things like they basically don't agree with. We've seen mass quotes come out, right, from all these other giant. I mean, whether it be Embracer. Embracer, I know it's just such a bad taste in your mouth to even say that name, but so many other ones, massive corporations, Microsoft and EA and, Epic or Riot or whoever, man, they've all been laying people off, right? And Larian's basically, a bunch of their executives have come out and said, we don't agree. All these big companies have been laying people off. They've all been coming out with the same excuse of, well, the industry's in a bad spot. Industry's in a bad spot, and you know, we got to do everything we can to save the company. And Larian's going, you know, it's you're talking about a company that listens to their player base, takes care of their employees, doesn't use microtransactions. You know what I mean? Like, and they're thriving right now in the industry, as opposed to all these other companies that basically do the opposite of that, and they're dwindling. I think that it's a telltale sign of maybe a bit of a turnover in the way that a lot of consumers and gaming enthusiasts are potentially addressing the industry nowadays, in being a little bit more critical of how we address taking care of good companies that take care of us, as opposed to seeing through some of these companies that have quit really giving a crap anymore. It's more about quantity over quality for a lot of these companies. How much can they push out with very little substance? And it's not about including us in the process. It's not about, you know, taking any kind of constructive feedback from us and what we want to see in the games. It's just about continuing to push out crap and expecting us to buy it based on the notion that it's got some name on it like Call of Duty or something like that, right? But I digress. I think that personally, one of the reasons that I thought that Larian didn't want to have anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons anymore was because of who was behind it, which was Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, which they come off as pretty disgusting companies to work with right now, honestly. And I don't think that Larian wants to be associated with them. And I don't blame him at all. So now that I've gotten that out, Baldur's Gate 4 started development in Larian Studios before they chose to do something else. Follow-up to Baldur's Gate 3 was at some point a reality before Larian Studios decided to move away from the franchise to pursue other ventures. Baldur's Gate 3 was an unprecedented success, the most the video game industry has experienced in years. An unrepeatable game that elevated one of the most emblematic franchises in history to the top, and at perhaps the most complex moment for games of its genre. Larian Studios confirmed that they would not be in charge of the fourth installment, but the CEO of the company, Sven Vink, revealed in an interview in PC Gamer that the studio came to have a partially playable version of Baldur's Gate 4. Quote, do we really want to do this for the next 3 years? Is a question that Vink and the rest of the Larian Studios asked themselves, which led to them deciding that continuing with the franchise was a sequel to Baldur's Gate 3 was not the most attractive thing for them as a company. A brave decision, as it is not easy to refuse to continue with something that you have elevated to the category of a timeless masterpiece, but at the same time, it's also tough to be able to match such a magnificent work. The relief of Larian Studios after BG3. During the interview, Vink stated that if something is super successful, obviously everyone's asking you, when are you going to make the next one? And when you, as a developer, come out of this little miserable cave that you've been sitting in for many, many hours, as you're finishing your thing, you're vulnerable. It's something that you all would have liked, I think. I'm sure actually, and we actually went pretty fast because the production machine was still warm. You could already play stuff, but you played it and you looked at it and like, you know, this is okay. I mean, we'll probably have to redo it 10 times. And do we really want to do this for the next 3 years? Quote, honestly, you really cannot explain or express it how liberated we are, said Vink. Currently, Larian Studios is developing 2 new RPGs, and we will have to pay attention to what one of the best companies in the video game industry has prepared for us. That's about all this entails for this article. And I think that, I mean, even though they're not coming out and outright stating it, basically what my perceived notion is, and I could totally be wrong here, okay? Absolutely. But there have been things we've hit in the news about basically Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast approaching Larian about potentially buying the licensing for D&D and stuff, and Larian was like, no, maybe you should talk to these people. you know? And I think in large part, it really just has to do with Larian not really wanting to get into bed with those companies. It seems that way anyways. It comes off as that. And what I will say is that this was good for all those companies involved, whether it be from Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast with licensing the Dungeons and Dragons stuff out for Baldur's Gate 3, because they obviously made a lot of money off that as well as look, Larian's been doing, you know, games of this nature previous to Baldur's Gate, and they've been good. The Divinity stuff, you know, they've been good. But I think the Baldur's Gate 3 stuff really kind of put them on the map as well, as far as like something on a whole other scale. I don't think anybody can really contrast that argument. You know, the Divinity stuff's always been cool, but it's all been on their like own propriety kind of system and mechanics and RPG stuff, right? As opposed to being based off of Dungeons and Dragons stuff. With the renowned success of Baldur's Gate 3, I think that it makes it a lot easier for Larian to go back, build off of what they had already been doing with things like, you know, their previous RPG entries, and you know, it'll continue. You know, they already had a lot of fans, but they have way more now. And they have way more people that are going to be interested in playing things that may not have the Baldur's Gate name on it now, too. And I think that they realize that as well. So I think that's another reason why they probably don't have a whole lot of interest in being associated with a company like... I think that if Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast came off as decent companies, they probably wouldn't have had a whole lot of reluctance on the point of continuing to try to do, in my opinion, more Baldur's Gate stuff. But I think that's at least part of the problem. It might not be the whole thing. It could just be part of the fact that they didn't want to continue doing Baldur's Gate stuff right now. That could be a large part of it. But I don't think that that's it. I do think that this plays a part of what's going on here. I don't know if we'll ever find out, but some of what we've found out in the past does make it kind of seem that way a little bit.